I forgot the right. Yeah. Okay. Well, my thanks to the organisers of this wonderful meeting. It's a real pleasure to be here. So thank you very much indeed. So my talk today is going to be about some behavioural studies looking at the influence of metacognitive judgments on the strategies that people use when it comes to remembering delayed intentions or prospective memory. So I'm very fortunate that we've already had a talk this morning about metacognition and also, at least covering in some detail, prospective memory. So rather than give very much background information, I'm just going to jump right in. So the kind of strategy that I have in mind here is what I'm going to call intention offloading, which is if you need to remember to do something in the future, when you act on your environment to create a perceptual cue or perceptual trigger for that delayed intention. So, well-known examples might be, I'm not sure whether this is a bit of a kind of over-British example, but anyway, tying knots in handkerchief to remind you of something, making notes of appointments in diaries and calendars and to-do lists and so on. Putting things in notable places, so you might, if you have to remember to take something with you tomorrow, leave it by your front door to trigger the intention when it comes to it. We also embed our intentions in our kind of social worlds as well as our physical ones by asking people to remind us to do things and so on. And these days, if you own a smartphone, then you can very easily talk to it and say something like, when I get home, remind me to buy milk, or even use a person-based reminder and say, when I speak to Michael, remind me to wish him a happy birthday, this kind of thing. So these are all ways in which we can kind of outsource control of our behavior to external devices and artifacts. And so rather than relying on a purely internal representation of our intentions, we are delegating that to a perceptual cue that we've ourselves created in our environment. And of course, especially with the advent of smartphones and wearable technologies and so on, this is increasingly playing a role in the way that we organize our behavior. So the argument that I want to make in the talk today is to suggest, first of all, that strategies like this have potentially an interesting relationship with metacognitive processes, that we can study these sorts of strategies empirically, but also that they've been somewhat neglected in the literature on prospective memory so far, which has tended to focus rather narrowly on situations where you don't give people much scope for strategic behavior and you limit their opportunities to adopt strategies like this. And I want to suggest that by limiting the sphere of study in this way, we're missing some of the kind of important metacognitive influences on complex behavior. Before I continue, I should point out I'm not saying that the literature on prospective memory ignores perceptual cueing of intentions. So probably something of a consensus view in the field would be McDaniel and Einstein's multiprocess model, according to which if you're going to remember a delayed intention, there are essentially two ways you can do it. You can either strategically monitor your environment, so you can wander around searching for a postbox if you know you have to post a letter, or alternatively, you might just happen to be walking past a postbox and that perceptually will trigger the delayed intention. And dual root models like this derive support from a kind of a wealth of behavioral findings and also other techniques. So for instance, here is one of our imaging studies where we suggested that depending on whether you are acting on a delayed intention in a more self-initiated or externally cued manner, you recruit separable brain systems within the prefrontal cortex. We've also implemented this sort of type of idea in a computational modeling framework. So here is a model in which you've got these units here which represent detection of a target that requires a delayed response. And these units can be triggered both by the top-down monitoring but also by direct perceptual cueing from these input units. And models like this that follow this kind of architecture can capture many of the behavioral findings that have been reported in the literature. So it's certainly the case that the literature on prospective memory has acknowledged the idea that our intentions are often triggered by perceptual cues. But what's not been studied very much is the way that we actually act in our environment ourselves to create those cues. And that's what I want to talk about here. So the overall argument is that laboratory tasks investigating prospective memory typically disallow the use of external reminders and strategies like that. So I had a look through what I could find in the literature about this, and I've only been able to find one single, out of hundreds of experiments reported in the literature, just one single study from 1990, which gave participants the option of setting their own reminder. Apart from that, the literature has very much focused on what happens when you just have to remember without these cues. But of course, in our everyday life, we often make use of these sorts of strategies. And this potentially has an interesting implication in terms of how we understand real-world failures in prospective memory. So if I'm planning to go to a meeting tomorrow and I don't turn up, it might just be because I'm bad at remembering that sort of thing. But these days, if you own a smartphone and you fail to do something important which you had planned to do, you've really got no excuse because you could very simply set up a very reliable trigger and you failed to do that. So perhaps a more interesting way of thinking about my failure to do something that was important and I could have easily triggered myself to do is a metacognitive error. That is to say that I have failed to recognize the fallibility of my own memory. I failed to recognize the benefit of setting these sorts of reminders, and that's really why I failed to act on my intentions. But if we don't allow people to use their own sorts of strategies, then we're not so able to detect these sorts of metacognitive influences. So in the remainder of the talk, I want to describe a few behavioral studies that are looking at kind of three main questions. First of all, can we elicit these kind of intention offloading behavior or reminder setting behavior in an experimental task? How does this behavior relate to metacognitive confidence? So I'll just pause for a second here because at the end of Steve's talk this morning, Etienne was asking, in what way is metacognition related to regulation of behavior? And I hope some of the data I'm going to present here speaks to that sort of question. And then third, insofar as there is a metacognitive influence on this sort of strategic behavior, to what extent does that reflect a domain-specific process that only applies to our thinking about that particular cognitive domain versus more domain-general metacognitive signals? Before I present any more data, let me just say that all of the data I'm going to present now is from online web-based experiments using this Mechanical Turk website. So the tasks have been programmed into a web browser, and people are doing them at home, and then the data is being uploaded to a remote server. So I'm just going to kind of say that, and then if anyone has any questions, I'm very happy to talk about it afterwards in terms of this methodology. So how can we study intention offloading in a kind of laboratory task? So let me show you the task which I'm going to be talking about quite a lot here. So this is an ongoing task in which people see these numbered circles, and they just need to drag them in order to the bottom of the screen, and it's very easy and straightforward, and nobody has any problem with that. So then, alongside this ongoing task, we're going to embed some delayed intentions. So for instance, you might do the same task, but now you're also told, but when you get to 3, drag that one to the left instead. So again, this is pretty straightforward, and people don't have much difficulty remembering these sorts of intentions. So this involves an intention delayed over a very brief period where you associate a forthcoming cue with an intended behavior, which is different to the standard ongoing one that you're producing. So sometimes it gets more difficult. So now you've got to remember 3 separate cues and 3 different associated responses. And at this point, the task starts to feel much more subjectively difficult. But people have a strategy available to them, which you'll see here. OK, so if you do this at the beginning of the trial, you've offloaded the intention, as it were. So you've set up a perceptual cue, and you don't need to remember after this point what it was you intended to do, because the positioning of the circle already tells you that. So this is supposed to be a bit of an analog A bit like an analogue of when you leave something by your front door so that you'll remember to bring it with you the next day, that you create a perceptual trigger in your environment in this way. So when people are introduced to the task, they are instructed about this strategy. They're told, you may want to set yourself reminders in this way, but it's entirely up to you whether you do so or not. So people are explicitly instructed that they can do this, but they're also told that it's optional whether to do so. So the main question in the studies then will be, for what proportion of these targets do people set up a reminder versus just trying to remember by themselves? So the first finding then is if we compare the situation where you've got 1 to remember versus 3, this is the externalizing proportion, or this proportion of reminders. People are much more likely to set reminders when they need to remember 3 things than when they remember 1. So I'm going to start a list here of some of the factors which influence this intention offloading behavior. Increased memory load is one of them. So secondly, what about the properties of the ongoing task in which that memory load is embedded? So I'm going to show you now a slightly different version of the task. So there's a separate group of participants who do this version here, which is exactly the same, except that people are interrupted whilst they're performing each trial. Here we go. So halfway through the trial or something, you'll get this arithmetic question, and it always comes before the first target you need to respond to. So the idea is that by doing this, you'll make it harder for people to remember their intended behavior. And indeed, when they're interrupted in this way, they set more reminders than when they're not interrupted. So we can add to our list then the presence of interruption in the ongoing task as a factor influencing this intention offloading behavior. So going back then to our graph of the proportion of trials in which people set reminders, it's tempting to interpret this as reflecting a metacognitive process, whereby as the difficulty of the task increases, people reflect on that difficulty and decide to compensate by setting these reminders. And we can investigate that question by looking at their actual performance. How well do they remember to execute these delayed intentions? So in a moment, I'm going to show you their actual performance level when they do this task here. But first of all, let me show you the accuracy at remembering the targets from a control study where people are prevented from setting reminders. So they only have to remember using their own kind of brain power. And it's an exact mirror image here, as you might predict. So as the task becomes more difficult, as indexed by their accuracy, when they can't set reminders, they then start presumably compensating. And we can now compare their accuracy when they do the task without reminders with the accuracy when they are allowed reminders. And you can see in both cases, there's a cost of 3 versus 1 target to remember. But when you allow offloading, the cost of interruption is entirely eliminated, which is quite evident here. So it seems then that participants strategically offload intentions into the external environment based on both the mnemonic load of the task and also the characteristics of the ongoing task in which it is embedded. And at least in some circumstances, this intention offloading allows participants to eliminate the cost of interruption. So there seems to be some suggestion here that this sort of strategic behavior relates to metacognitive judgments. But the aim for the next study then is to try and make a more explicit link between this sort of strategic behavior and metacognition. So how does this behavior relate to metacognitive confidence? So this next experiment, participants do the same task, but they now do it in 2 phases. So in phase 1 of the task, they get about 2 or 3 practice trials, and then they have to make a prediction for how well they think they're going to do at the task. So this gives them a prospective confidence judgment. We then give them 10 trials of the task where we prevent them from setting reminders. And after that, we tell them that they are now able to use this intention offloading strategy. They make a further prediction for how well they think they're going to do, followed by, finally, task performance when they are able to set reminders. So we can look at on what proportion of trials do they set reminders here, and we can relate that to what is their confidence in their unaided ability and what is their objective performance when they're not able to set reminders, to investigate the role of these factors in this behavior. So in this experiment, there's 2 independent samples of participants. One group of participants get the easy version of the task, where there's only ever one target and they don't get interrupted. And in the hard version, there are 3 targets and interruption. So I'm just going to skip right into a kind of a path analysis approach where we try to investigate how do these factors relate to each other. The overall behavioral performance of the task was very similar to the one I've just shown you. So let me explain what I'm showing you here. So this experiment has a very strict sequential ordering of the measures which are taken. So they make a prediction in phase 1, they perform in phase 1, they make a prediction in phase 2, they then offload their intentions on some proportion of trials, which presumably influences their performance. So for each of these variables, we're going to try to decompose the variance using a multiple regression approach in terms of the unique contribution of each of the antecedent variables linked in to each one. So if we start at the end here at phase 2 performance, how much variance in that performance can we attribute to each of these unique predictors? So looking first at phase 1 performance, in both versions of the task, people who are good at the task without reminders are also good at the task with reminders. So this is perhaps not surprising that the 2 phases show some relationship in terms of the performance level. But also, the proportion of trials on which people set reminders is an additional significant contributor to performance, even after controlling for this performance here. So of the variance we're able to explain here, about 1/3 of it is attributable to people's strategic behavior rather than their unaided ability as measured in phase 1 of the task. So there seems to be some additional kind of contribution to their performance in phase 2 beyond their unaided ability. There's no significant path weights here. So we can now ask, so how can we predict who sets reminders and who doesn't? And the first finding is that for both versions of the experiment, people who predict that they'll be good at the task without reminders don't bother setting reminders when they can, or conversely, people who are pessimistic about their ability go on to set reminders when they can. And I think perhaps an interesting thing here is if we look at the relationship between these predictions in phase 1 and their performance, in the hard version of the task, indeed, people can predict how well they're going to do. But actually, the relationship between people's prospective predictions and their actual performance in phase 1 in this easy version of the task, there's absolutely no relationship whatsoever. So in other words, people who think they're going to be bad at the task go on to set reminders, even when those metacognitive judgments are erroneous, or even when those metacognitive judgments have no relationship with their actual objective ability when they do this task. So another factor influencing intention offloading then is predicted poor unaided ability at the task, even when that prediction is actually uncorrelated with how well they will actually do. Secondly, if we look at this path here, there are additional significant path weights such that people who are objectively bad at the task when they can't set reminders, they then go on to set reminders when they are given the opportunity. And these, given that this is a multiple regression approach, these 2 influences are independent of each other, or at least they hold even after controlling for the other. So possibly what we're seeing here is that people who detect errors when they perform the task without being able to set reminders, they then notice their own fallibility and go on to set reminders. But there are other possible explanations as well. So perhaps the sorts of people who do badly at the task have just learnt, perhaps without conscious reportability of this strategy, that they ought to use reminders when they can. And so there are kind of multiple ways in which people who are objectively bad at these sorts of tasks might have learnt to use these strategies, even without perhaps being able to reflect on the strategies that they choose. So we can add now to our list poor objective unaided ability, independent of predicted performance, is an additional predictor of people's choice of strategy in this task. So what about the third question here? So I've suggested that people's prospective metacognitive judgments about their ability to do the task influences their strategic behavior. So an obvious question is it just people's predictions about this very task that influences their strategies? Or is it a more domain general confidence signal which potentially applies across multiple different tasks. The reason why this is perhaps an important question is that given what I've just shown here, that people set reminders when they think they need them, this suggests a possible kind of therapeutic intervention by which, by reducing people's confidence in a task, we can increase strategic behavior. And if this is reflecting a domain general confidence signal, this suggests a single intervention can possibly have a influence across multiple domains. So that's perhaps a reason to investigate whether this is a domain-specific or a domain-general metacognitive signal here. So this is a follow-up study doing exactly the same thing as the one that I just shown you, but with 2 additional tasks. So people are doing a pair of perceptual judgments in different blocks of the experiment. This is very much based on some of the work that Steve has done previously that you've heard about this morning. So we're going to have a staircase procedure whereby we titrate the difficulty of the task so that there are no systematic individual differences in the proportion of correct perceptual judgments. Sorry, I should explain what they're doing. So in this task, you have to say which side of the screen has more filled squares than the other. And this one, you have to say which side of the screen has a higher contrast between the squares than the other. So we eliminate individual differences, systematic individual differences in their accuracy at the task. And we ask them after each trial, how confident were they in the response they've made? And we can end up with something like this. So there's about 300 people in this study, and they're ranked here from their mean confidence, which you can see goes from thinking that you're guessing almost every single trial to thinking that you're very confident every single trial. But this is decorrelated from people's actual accuracy when they do this task. So this is a bias signal, a bias towards high or low confidence, as it relates to one's perceptual judgments. But you can see this is the proportion of reminders people set when they do the intention offloading task, and this is their confidence in their perceptual judgments. The people who are least confident in their perceptual judgments also set more reminders in the memory task. And conversely, those who are most confident in their perceptual judgment set the fewest reminders. And this is despite the fact that the perceptual confidence was entirely unrelated to any objective measure of performance. It's purely a bias signal. So this suggests some domain general confidence signals which potentially influence strategic behavior across diverse cognitive domains. I should say this here is the mean confidence as opposed to what Steve was mostly talking about this morning of metacognitive sensitivity. So where metacognitive sensitivity refers to our ability to distinguish individual correct trials from individual incorrect ones, which in this study correlated between the 2 perceptual tasks, but not elsewhere. Here it was the actual just mean level of confidence that was the best predictor of strategic behavior. So we can add to our list low domain general confidence as well. Last of all, I haven't shown you any data for this, but in the studies that I've been talking about today, older adults were more likely to set reminders than younger ones. And this potentially relates to a finding in the field of the so-called age-related prospective memory paradox, which is that when you bring them into the laboratory, older adults do worse at prospective memory tasks than younger adults. But in the real world, if you ask people, phone me in 1 week's time, for instance, the older adults will typically perform just as well as the younger ones. And one possible contributor to this finding would be that older adults typically do have a reduced confidence in their memory abilities. And that itself may be a trigger for increased strategic behavior, which can compensate for these sorts of difficulties in the task. So to wrap up then, participants frequently offload intentions into the external environment when you give them the chance. And intention offloading is influenced by mnemonic load of the task, characteristics of the task in which the intention is embedded, both of which may relate to metacognitive factors about beliefs about difficulty of the task. It's also influenced by prior metacognitive confidence, both in a task-specific and a domain general sense. And it's further influenced by objective ability when people do the task without being able to set reminders. So more generally then, metacognitive judgments influence strategy choice. And I think one potential difficulty when we have to remember delayed intentions. So insofar as this talk and also Etienne's talk was about how do you choose what strategy to use. And in Etienne's paradigm, you're choosing a strategy on which you get feedback almost immediately about how effective you are. If I have a meeting to attend next week and I decide I'm going to use a particular encoding strategy, the prediction error in the strategic choice that I've made is only delivered long after the choice is made. So this creates a real difficulty insofar as if we are going to learn optimal strategies for encoding delayed intentions, and we're going to learn from prediction errors, then the time at which you make your prediction and the time at which you receive your feedback are very far apart in time. And this, I think, is a fundamental problem in learning good strategies for delayed intentions. And I'd be very interested if anyone's got any ideas about how you can kind of override that sort of difficulty. Last of all, I want to suggest that as opposed to the more kind of narrow laboratory studies which don't give people much choice over their strategic behavior, by allowing participants greater choice over strategies, this gives us methodologies which give us a better ability to investigate the relationship between metacognitive judgments and the strategies that people use. Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry, last of all, thank you to